She thought it was just a routine traffic stop. She was wrong. When Lieutenant Commander Tiana Cole, a decorated military intelligence officer, is pulled over by two corrupt cops, she quickly realizes that this isn't about a traffic violation. It's a setup, and worse, it's part of something much larger. What begins as a local conspiracy spirals into a dangerous game of power and deception. The deeper Tiana digs, the darker the truth becomes. The police aren't just dirty, they're part of a network, a machine, one that's funneling weapons, military technology, and influence through the highest levels of government and military infrastructure. At the center of it all stands August Mercer, a ruthless corporate figure with deep ties to military supply chains and defense contracts. He's not just powerful, he's untouchable, and he's already set the next phase of the operation in motion. Tiana's mission isn't just about taking down a few dirty cops anymore. Now, she's up against an entire system, one that's designed to protect itself at any cost. And Mercer isn't going down without a fight. What happens when the people sworn to protect you are the ones pulling the strings? How do you take down a machine built to survive the truth? Tiana is about to find out. Stay with us as this story unfolds, filled with explosive confrontations, deadly betrayals, and a final reckoning that will change everything. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. And tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Let the games begin. The dim orange glow of the streetlights flickered against the slick pavement as the rain hammered down, creating a rhythmic pattern on the roof of the black sedan. Tiana Cole's hands rested steadily on the steering wheel as her eyes scanned the nearly deserted street. The soft hum of the engine blended with the distant murmur of the storm. She had been driving for hours, heading back from a classified meeting that had taken longer than expected. It was late, almost midnight, and the only company on the road was the occasional passing car and the glint of wet asphalt beneath the streetlights. Tiana adjusted her rearview mirror, catching a flash of red and blue lights cutting through the darkness. Her stomach tightened as the shrill sound of a police siren pierced through the night. Her training kicked in almost instantly. Breathe. Stay calm. She signaled and pulled to the side of the road, her mind already working through the possible scenarios. The reflection of the flashing lights illuminated the interior of her car, bouncing off the black leather seats. Her hands remained still as two silhouettes emerged from the squad car behind her, the outlines of their figures distorted by the rain-streaked glass. A hard rap on the driver's side window made her jaw tighten. Slowly, she rolled down the window, the cold bite of the night air brushing against her face. Two officers stood there. One was tall, broad-shouldered, and middle-aged with a weathered face. His name tag read Reese. The other was younger, wiry, with sharp eyes and a permanent sneer on his lips. Mallory, his tag read. License and registration. Officer Reese said, his tone flat and mechanical. Tiana met his gaze calmly. What seems to be the problem, officer? You were speeding, Reese replied. His gaze sharpened as his eyes swept across the car's interior. License and registration. Tiana reached into her glove compartment with slow, deliberate movements, handing over the documents. Reese's eyes narrowed as he scanned the information. You live around here? Reese asked. Yes, Tiana replied evenly. Mallory circled the car like a shark, his hand resting on the handle of his holstered weapon. Tiana's gaze followed him carefully through the side mirror. Her pulse remained steady, though the tension in the air was palpable. Reese leaned down, the scent of coffee and stale cigarettes on his breath. Step out of the car. Tiana's eyes darkened slightly. What? Reese's smile didn't reach his eyes. You match the description of someone involved in a robbery earlier tonight. That's impossible, Tiana replied. I've been driving for the past 3 hours. Step out of the car, Reese repeated, his hand dropping to the baton at his waist. Tiana's heart hammered against her chest, but her face remained impassive. Slowly, she opened the door and stepped out, the cold rain soaking through her jacket. Her hands were raised slightly in a gesture of compliance. Mallory closed the distance between them with predatory swiftness. Turn around. Tiana's jaw clenched. There's no need for this. Turn around, Mallory repeated, his voice hardening. Her instinct screamed at her to fight back, but she forced herself to stay still as Mallory grabbed her arm and roughly twisted it behind her back. The metal cuffs snapped around her wrists. "You're making a mistake," she said calmly, her voice level. "Yeah." Reese's eyes gleamed with malice. "We'll see about that." They shoved her toward the squad car, ignoring her protests. Tiana's pulse quickened as the doors of the squad car slammed shut behind her. She stared out the window as Reese and Mallory spoke to each other, laughing. The storm outside intensified, raindrops pelting the windows like small bullets. Minutes later, they pulled into the police station. The station was dimly lit and smelled faintly of mildew and cheap cleaning products. Mallory opened the door and yanked her out of the car, his grip bruising. They marched her through the station, past rows of cubicles where officers in rumpled uniforms glanced up with fleeting interest before returning to their work. Reese and Mallory led her to a cold, gray holding cell and shoved her inside. The door slammed shut behind her with a metallic clang. Tiana sat down on the hard bench, her back straight, her chin lifted. Her mind raced, calculating her next move. She had survived worse situations than this, far worse. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, followed by the low hum of conversation. Mallory returned, standing outside the cell with Reese beside him. The smirk on Mallory's face made her blood heat. "You know," Mallory said, "you're awfully calm for someone facing felony charges." "I have nothing to hide," Tiana replied. "That's so." Reese leaned closer to the bars. "Maybe you're used to being in trouble." Tiana's dark eyes locked onto his with steely precision. "Or maybe I know how this is going to end." Reese chuckled. "And how's that?" Tiana leaned back, a small, almost imperceptible smile curling at the corner of her mouth. "You'll see," she said quietly. Suddenly, the sound of a phone vibrating in Reese's pocket broke the tension. He answered, his face darkening as he listened to the voice on the other end. "What?" Reese barked. "She's what?" Mallory's smirk faltered. Reese's hand lowered slowly from his ear. His gaze snapped toward Tiana. "Get her out," Reese ordered. His voice was low and sharp. Mallory frowned. "What? Get her out," Reese repeated, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of disbelief and barely concealed panic. Mallory pulled out a key and opened the cell door. Tiana stood slowly, brushing imaginary dust off her jacket. Her gaze remained fixed on Reese as she stepped toward him. "What's going on?" Mallory asked, his brows furrowing. "She's not just anyone," Reese growled. "She's military intelligence. High-ranking." Mallory's eyes widened. "Bullshit. Check the system yourself," Reese spat. Tiana's smile widened slightly. "Now you're starting to get it." Reese's face twisted with barely contained rage. "You knew exactly who we were. Why the hell didn't you say something?" Tiana adjusted her sleeves. "Because I want to see how far you'd take it." Mallory's mouth opened and closed as he struggled to process the situation. Reese's fists clenched at his sides. "Lieutenant Commander Tiana Cole," she said smoothly, "United States Military Intelligence, Special Operations Division." Reese's eyes darkened. Mallory looked pale. Tiana's gaze sharpened. This was a test." Mallory stepped back, shaking his head. "This isn't over." Tiana's smile faded. "You're right about that." As she turned toward the door, Reese's voice followed her. "You're not walking away from this." Tiana paused at the threshold, her hand resting on the metal frame of the door. "You have no idea," she said softly, "what's about to happen." She stepped into the hallway, leaving the two stunned officers behind as the storm outside howled louder. Tiana's heels echoed sharply against the polished concrete floor of the police station's corridor. Her stride was measured, her posture crisp and controlled. Behind her, Reese and Mallory still stood frozen outside the holding cell, their stunned expressions etched into the dim light of the station. The weight of her last words still hung in the air. A pair of junior officers glanced up from their desks as she passed by, their curious stares following her every movement. Their eyes flicked toward Reese and Mallory, as though searching for some kind of explanation for the abrupt shift in atmosphere. Tiana's focus sharpened. Reese and Mallory were dangerous. Not because they were particularly clever, but because they were arrogant enough to believe they were untouchable. She had dealt with men like them before, the type who hid behind a badge and a uniform, mistaking power for righteousness. She pushed through the station doors, stepping into the cool night air. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, but the streets still glistened under the flickering glow of the streetlights. Her black sedan was parked where she'd left it, but before she could approach it, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Lieutenant Cole. Tiana's muscles tightened for half a second before her gaze settled on the man's silhouette. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a dark suit that blended too easily with the night. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back, and the gleam of a government-issued badge flashed beneath his jacket. "Director Blake," Tiana greeted smoothly. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Blake's piercing blue eyes studied her for a moment before he smiled faintly. "I got a call about some irregularities involving 2 local officers." "Irregularities?" Tiana's lips curled slightly. "That's one way to describe it." Blake's smile faded. "Care to explain why a lieutenant commander of military intelligence was dragged into a holding cell on false charges?" Tiana's eyes darkened. "I'll let them do it." Blake's brow lifted. "Let them. They've been under surveillance for months," Tiana said, her voice sharpening. "Reese and Mallory are part of a protection racket. Drugs, arms smuggling, human trafficking. We've had pieces of the puzzle for a while, but nothing definitive. Tonight, they gave me exactly what I needed." Blake's gaze sharpened. "They tried to frame you?" Tiana's smile faded. "It was more than that. They were testing me. Someone tipped them off that an intelligence officer was sniffing around." Blake's jaw tightened. "Do you think they know you're the one investigating them?" Tiana shook her head. "No. If they had, they wouldn't have let me walk out of there." Blake's expression darkened. "You're playing a dangerous game." Tiana's eyes flashed with cold resolve. "It's not a game if I'm the one holding the cards." Blake studied her carefully before exhaling through his nose. "What's your next move?" Tiana's gaze drifted toward the dark horizon, her mind already turning over the next steps. "I need to follow the money." Blake's expression tightened. "That'll lead you to the source." Tiana's gaze sharpened. "Exactly." Blake hesitated. "Tiana, I know what you're going to say." Tiana cut in. "And no, I'm not going to sit this one out." Blake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're too close to this." "That's exactly why I need to be the one to finish it," Tiana said, her voice low and cutting. Blake's mouth tightened. He knew better than to argue with her when she was like this. Finally, he nodded. "I'll arrange for the files. Whatever you need, you'll have it." Tiana's eyes darkened. "Good." As Blake turned to walk away, Tiana's phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A blocked number. She answered. "Cole." A distorted voice came through the line. "Male. Cold. Controlled. You're in over your head, Lieutenant." Tiana's hand tightened around the phone. "That's funny. I was about to say the same to you." The voice chuckled faintly. "Walk away. Before it's too late." Tiana's smile was sharp. "You don't scare me." "You should be scared," the voice replied. "Reese and Mallory are just the beginning. If you keep digging, you won't make it out alive." The line went dead. Tiana lowered the phone slowly, her pulse steady despite the weight of the threat. Her eyes narrowed toward the distant shadows beneath the streetlights. She had spent her entire career walking toward danger. This was nothing new. She slipped her phone into her pocket and climbed into the driver's seat of her car. Her hands settled on the wheel as the low rumble of the engine filled the quiet night. The pieces were starting to align, the corruption within the department, the protection racket, and the deeper network beneath it all. The question now was not if Reese and Mallory were working with someone. It was who, and why had they gone after her specifically? As the rain began to fall harder, Tiana's gaze sharpened beneath the glow of the streetlights. It was time to start digging. Tiana sat at her desk, her laptop glowing softly beneath the dim light of her apartment. The encrypted FBI server opened as she typed in her clearance code. Blake had already delivered on his promise. Every file connected to Reese, Mallory, and any suspicious activity within the precinct was waiting for her. Her eyes scanned through the records swiftly her military-trained mind sorting through the data at lightning speed. Multiple complaints of excessive force, altered arrest reports, missing evidence, suspicious financial records. And then she saw it. A bank account. It was flagged in connection to multiple cash deposits, all tied to a known cartel operation. The same cartel that had been smuggling arms through military supply chains overseas. Her gaze sharpened as the name of the account holder appeared on the screen. Randall Klein, Chief of Police. Tiana's jaw tightened. The corruption wasn't limited to Reese and Mallory. This ran all the way to the top. Suddenly, the lights in her apartment flickered. A sharp noise from outside the window made her eyes narrow. Her hand instinctively slid toward the drawer where her service pistol rested. The sound came again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Tiana rose from her chair slowly. She crossed the room and edged toward the window. The street below was empty, except for the black SUV parked beneath the street lamp. Its engine was still running. Her phone buzzed again. She answered without looking at the screen. "Hello." A low voice answered. "You should have walked away." A figure emerged from the SUV, a tall, broad-shouldered man dressed in black. His face was hidden beneath the hood of his jacket. Tiana's gaze narrowed. "Come and get me," she said quietly. The figure hesitated. Then he smiled. "That's the plan." The line went dead. Tiana stepped away from the window as the figure moved toward the building's entrance. She pulled the pistol from the drawer, checked the magazine, and chambered round. Her pulse remained steady as her gaze sharpened toward the door. If they wanted a fight, they were about to get one. The darkened apartment was deathly still. Tiana's pulse remained calm and steady as her gaze locked on the door. Her service pistol rested comfortably in her hand, the cold weight of the metal grounding her. 3 sets of footsteps, heavy, deliberate. Her sharp hearing picked up the faint click of a safety being released. Automatic, high caliber, military grade, not the kind of equipment carried by street thugs. They were professionals. A low knock echoed through the apartment. "They're testing me." Tiana's eyes narrowed. Slowly, she moved toward the wall, pressing her back against the cool surface as another knock came. Louder this time. Her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "Come quietly, Lieutenant Cole, or we come in." Tiana smiled faintly. She didn't answer. Instead, she slipped toward the back of the room, positioning herself near the window that overlooked the alleyway. Her fingers traced the edge of the curtain. Through the thin slit, she saw the black SUV parked beneath the streetlight. The engine was still running. 2 figures stood guard near the passenger door, both holding rifles. From the corner of her eye, she spotted movement near the fire escape. A 3rd figure. 3 operatives. Coordinated. Trained. The knock came again. Harder this time. "Lieutenant," a deep voice called. "Open the door." Tiana's jaw tightened. She held the gun close to her side and slipped toward the edge of the room. The silence stretched thin and taut. 3 seconds passed. Then the sound of metal against metal. "They're picking the lock." Tiana's eyes darkened. "Good. Let them try." A faint click echoed as the lock gave way. The door opened an inch. Tiana raised the pistol. The first man entered, dressed in tactical gear, body armor, helmet, visor, SWAT style, but unmarked. His rifle was raised as he swept the room. Tiana aimed. A single shot rang out. The man dropped like a stone, the rifle falling from his hands as he collapsed to the floor with a hard thud. "Shit!" The second man surged through the door, rifle raised. Tiana dropped to the floor and rolled behind the couch. A burst of gunfire shredded the air above her head, bullets ripping through the cheap fabric. Tiana's heart hammered as her instincts sharpened. Her mind calculated angles and trajectory in a millisecond. The man circled toward the side of the room, his bootsteps heavy against the floor. Tiana slid her body low, in beneath the couch, and fired. The bullet struck his knee. He screamed and collapsed, his rifle clattering to the ground. The third man appeared in the doorway, his figure silhouetted against the hallway light. Tiana recognized him immediately. Reese. A slow smile spread across his face. He stepped over the body of his wounded partner, holding his pistol loosely at his side. "Well," Reese said, Looks like you've still got some fight in you. Tiana's eyes narrowed. And you're still bad at your job. Reese chuckled darkly. Oh, Lieutenant, you have no idea what you're up against. Tiana's grip tightened around her pistol. Why don't you enlighten me? Reese's smile sharpened. You think you're hunting down a couple of dirty cops? You think Mallory and I were working alone? Tiana's gaze sharpened. Who's behind this? Reese's eyes glinted with cold amusement. You think I'm going to tell you that? Tiana's smile was razor sharp. You already did. She fired. Reese dodged at the last second, the bullet grazing his shoulder. He stumbled back, cursing. Tiana surged toward him with predatory swiftness, knocking the gun from his hand. She drove her knee into his chest, slamming him back against the wall. Reese's breath exploded from his lungs. He struggled, but Tiana's forearm pressed into his throat, cutting off his air supply. Who's behind this? She demanded. Reese's lips curled in a strained smile. You already know. Tiana's eyes narrowed. Randall Klein, Chief of Police. A cold knot formed in her stomach. She tightened her grip. What's Klein's play? Reese's smile widened, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. Wouldn't you like to know? Tiana's finger twitched on the trigger. A sudden crash from the hallway forced her to step back. Reese sagged against the wall, coughing. Mallory appeared in the doorway, his gun drawn. Let him go. Tiana's jaw flexed. Slowly, she lowered the gun and took a step back. Reese's smile remained cold as he rubbed his bruised throat. You don't get to walk away from this, Cole. You'll have to stop me first, Tiana replied. Mallory's gaze darkened. Oh, we will. Tiana's eyes flashed with quiet fury. You've already lost. She turned and walked past them, stepping over the unconscious bodies on the floor as she headed toward the door. Lieutenant, Reese called after her. Tiana stopped at the threshold, her back toward them. You think you're ready for this? Reese said darkly. You don't even know what you're fighting. Tiana's gaze flicked toward him over her shoulder. I've fought worse. And then she was gone. Tiana sat in a dimly lit safe house, the metallic glow of her laptop illuminating her face. Her wet hair was slicked back, her face still streaked with sweat and rain. The encrypted FBI server was open. Blake's name flashed across the secure line. She answered. Blake. Tiana. His voice was sharp. What the hell happened? They made a move, Tiana replied. It's bigger than I thought. How big? Tiana's gaze darkened. Chief Randall Klein is dirty. Reese and Mallory are part of it. It's not just corruption. It's a full-scale operation. Blake's tone sharpened. What kind of operation? Drugs. Weapons. Human trafficking, Tiana said coldly. They're using the police department as cover. Blake swore. Are you certain? Tiana's lips thinned. Reese all but confirmed it. Blake's breath hissed through the line. You need to stand down. This is too dangerous. Tiana's eyes flashed with quiet steel. You know that's not happening. Tiana. I have a lead, Tiana interrupted. Reese and Mallory have been laundering money through a shell company. I traced the financials. The same company is tied to military contractors overseas. Blake's silence was sharp. That's impossible. Tiana's gaze darkened. It's not. Blake's voice tightened. Then we're looking at something much bigger than a dirty police department. I'm going after them, Tiana said. Blake's tone turned hard. You're going to start a war. Tiana's smile was cold. I've already started one. Tiana. She ended the call. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she pulled up the address linked to the shell company. A private warehouse on the outskirts of the city. A single name appeared at the bottom of the file. Randall Klein. Tiana's gaze sharpened. You wanted to fight? She muttered. She closed the laptop, slipped her gun into her holster, and pulled her jacket tight around her shoulders. Let's finish it. The rain lashed against the windshield of Tiana's black sedan as it cut through the dim backstreets of the industrial district. The hum of the engine blended with the rhythmic thudding of the rain, creating a steady pulse beneath her fingertips as she gripped the steering wheel. Her mind was sharp, focused. The address tied to the shell company, Kingsley Logistics, led her to a warehouse on the city's southern edge. The area was nearly abandoned, a cluster of decaying buildings, rusting shipping containers, and broken streetlights. The type of place where no one asked questions. Her Glock rested in the holster beneath her jacket. She had cleaned and prepped it before leaving the safe house. The weight of the gun was familiar, comforting, but her instincts told her this wasn't going to be a clean operation. This was a trap. She knew that, and she was walking into it anyway. Her phone buzzed against the dashboard. Blake's name flashed on the screen. She answered without looking. Tiana. Blake's voice was sharp. Tell me you're not heading to that warehouse. I'm not telling you that, Tiana replied. Blake's sigh crackled through the line. Damn it. You know this is a setup. I'm counting on it. You're not invincible, Tiana. No, Tiana said quietly. But I'm prepared. Tiana. She ended the call. A rusted chain-link fence surrounded the warehouse, crowned with coils of barbed wire. A single gate stood partially open, swinging lazily in the wind. Beyond the fence, the warehouse loomed like a dark skeleton beneath the storm-heavy sky. Dim yellow light spilled through gaps in the corrugated metal walls, flickering as though struggling to stay alive. Tiana killed the engine and stepped out into the rain. Her boots splashed against the wet pavement as she approached the gate. She slipped through the opening, her steps light and measured as she scanned the perimeter. 2 guards at the entrance. Both men were dressed in tactical gear, hands resting on their sidearms. Not police. Mercenaries. One of them spotted her and lifted a hand toward his earpiece. Hold it right there, he called out. Tiana's hand hovered near the edge of her jacket, her fingers grazing the handle of her Glock. I'm expected, she said calmly. The guards exchanged glances. One of them reached for his radio. Yeah, she's here. A pause, then a low chuckle. He says to let her in. The guard's gaze sharpened. You sure about this, lady? Tiana's smile didn't reach her eyes. Are you? The guard's smirk flattened. He stepped aside. Tiana moved past them, her boots echoing against the concrete floor as she stepped into the warehouse. The inside was cavernous and cold. Stacks of wooden crates and steel storage containers lined the walls, their sides stamped with military inventory codes. A metal catwalk ran along the upper perimeter, shrouded in darkness. The dim light from the overhead fixtures barely illuminated the space below. A figure stood near the center of the room. Tall, broad-shouldered, silver hair, a tailored suit. Chief Randall Klein. Tiana's gaze sharpened. Klein smiled faintly as he stepped toward her. His polished leather shoes clicked against the floor. Lieutenant Cole, Klein said smoothly. You've been busy. Tiana's eyes narrowed. You knew I was coming. Of course, Klein replied. After all, you've been digging where you shouldn't. Tiana's lips tightened. How deep does it go? Klein's smile widened. Deep enough. He gestured toward the crates. Military-grade weapons. Custom smuggling routes through police-controlled zones. Supply chains overseas. You already know most of it. Reese and Mallory were just the front line, Tiana said coldly. Correct, Klein replied. But they weren't the ones calling the shots. Then who was? Klein's smile darkened. Wouldn't you like to know? Tiana's gaze swept the shadows above. Figures moved along the catwalk, armed men dressed in black. Suppressed rifles. Their footsteps blended with the hum of the ventilation fans overhead. An ambush. You should have stayed in Washington, Klein said. This isn't your fight. Tiana's smile was cold. That's where you're wrong. Klein's gaze sharpened. What do you think is going to happen here, Cole? You've got me surrounded, Tiana replied evenly. Armed men at every exit. No backup. No exit strategy. Klein's smile widened. Exactly. Tiana's gaze darkened. Which is why you should be asking yourself. Her hand slid beneath her jacket. Why I came here in the first place. Tiana's gun was up and firing before Klein's expression shifted from amusement to rage. The first shot struck the light fixture above, plunging the room into darkness. Tiana dropped low as the armed men on the catwalk opened fire. Muzzle flashes lit the shadows, bullets sparking against the metal containers as Tiana sprinted toward cover. She fired 3 quick shots toward the catwalk, striking one of the gunmen in the leg. He screamed as he tumbled over the railing, crashing to the floor below. Another burst of gunfire shredded the crates beside her. Splinters exploded into the air. Tiana ducked behind the cover of a steel container, her back pressed against the cool metal. Her breathing remained steady. Her mind raced. 6 hostiles left. No clear line to the exit. No problem. She reloaded, snapping the magazine into place with practiced precision. A figure emerged from the shadows. Tiana spun toward him, firing twice. Chest shot, head shot. The man collapsed instantly. Tiana. Klein's voice echoed through the darkness. You really think you can walk away from this? Tiana's smile was sharp. I'm not walking. She surged from cover, firing toward the nearest target. The man stumbled as the bullet caught his shoulder. Footsteps pounded toward her from the left. Tiana dropped into a low crouch, swept the attacker's legs out from under him, and finished him with a single shot to the chest. Another shot blasted past her head, close enough that she could feel the heat of the bullet. She rolled behind a crate and reloaded. The sound of boots scraped against the floor behind her. Klein's voice was close now. What's your play, Lieutenant? Tiana's gaze sharpened. You think I don't have one? Klein's eyes narrowed. Suddenly, a low humming noise filled the room. A high-pitched whine followed as red laser dots swept across the warehouse walls, targeting reticles. Klein's expression shifted from confusion to rage. The doors at the far end of the warehouse burst open. Armed tactical agents in black gear stormed the room. Tactical team, drop your weapons. Klein's men hesitated too long. A hail of gunfire erupted as the tactical agents opened fire. Klein's remaining men were cut down in a matter of seconds. Tiana rose from her cover as Blake stepped through the doorway, his weapon drawn. His gaze swept the room before settling on Klein. Chief Klein, Blake said coolly, you're under arrest. Klein's mouth twisted in rage. You can't touch me. Blake's smile was thin. You'd be surprised. 2 agents stepped forward, securing Klein's hands behind his back with zip ties. Klein's eyes locked on Tiana. This isn't over, he hissed. Tiana stepped toward him. Oh, it's over, she replied softly. Klein's glare darkened as the agents dragged him toward the exit. Blake's gaze swept toward Tiana. You knew I'd send backup, Blake said. I counted on it, Tiana replied. Blake shook his head. You're insane. Tiana's smile widened. I'm just getting started. Tiana stood beneath the dull, white glow of the interrogation room's overhead light, arms crossed over her chest. The cold metal table separated her from Randall Klein, who sat slouched in the chair across from her, hands bound in thick zip ties. His once pristine suit was rumpled, his silver hair hanging limp across his forehead. Despite his disheveled state, the cold gleam in his eyes remained sharp. You look uncomfortable, Chief, Tiana said, her voice low and edged with steel. Klein's smile was faint. Let's not pretend you've won. Tiana's gaze sharpened. You're sitting in a federal facility, charged with conspiracy, corruption, arms trafficking, and human rights violations. She leaned forward, hands braced against the table. Sounds like a win to me. Klein's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. Winning implies the game is over. Tiana's jaw tightened. Then let me make something clear. It's over. Klein chuckled. You're smarter than that, Cole. You know this doesn't end with me. Tiana's eyes narrowed. Then why don't you save us both some time and tell me who it does end with? Klein leaned back, his gaze gleaming with quiet amusement. You think I'm scared of you? Tiana smiled thinly. No, but you should be scared of who's coming after you. Klein's expression darkened. You've been protected for years, Tiana said, and now you've been cut off. Your men are dead or in custody. Your accounts have been frozen. The government is already stripping you of your rank. You've lost everything. Klein's smile returned, sharp this time. I lost nothing, he said. You think Reese and Mallory were my ace in the hole? You think this network is confined to a single city? Tiana's jaw flexed. Then who's pulling the strings? Klein's smile widened. You'll find out soon enough. Tiana's gaze sharpened. You really think you're going to walk away from this? I don't need to walk away, Klein replied smoothly, because soon there won't be anything left standing. Tiana's breath slowed. What's coming? Klein's gaze glittered with malice. A correction. A knock sounded at the door. Blake's sharp figure appeared behind the glass panel. His expression was tight, his eyes colder than usual. Tiana stepped back from the table and opened the door. Blake's gaze flicked toward Klein. Anything? Blake asked. Just noise, Tiana replied. Blake's gaze darkened. We've got a problem. Tiana followed him down the hallway, leaving Klein behind. Her footsteps echoed against the sterile floor as they entered a small conference room. Blake closed the door behind them, then placed a tablet on the table. He tapped the screen. A live news feed appeared. Tiana's gaze sharpened as the anchor's tense expression filled the screen. Breaking news. An explosion has rocked the port of Silverton earlier this morning. Initial reports indicate several casualties, and local authorities are investigating the possibility of sabotage. Tiana's brow furrowed. Silverton's a major supply hub. Blake's mouth tightened. It gets worse. He tapped the screen again. A security feed appeared, grainy, black and white. The timestamp showed the footage was less than 2 hours old. Figures in tactical gear were moving through a storage facility. They carried assault rifles and explosives. One of the men turned toward the camera. His face was partially obscured by a mask, but the insignia on his arm was visible. Tiana's blood ran cold. "That's military gear," she said. Blake nodded grimly. "Classified issue. Only accessible through high-level government contractors." Tiana's jaw tightened. "You think Klein's network got their hands on it?" Blake's eyes sharpened. "I think Klein's network supplied it." Tiana's pulse hammered. "Who were the targets?" Blake's gaze darkened. "Federal shipments. Weapons and medical supplies routed for distribution to overseas outposts. The same shipments Klein's shell company was moving." Tiana's gaze sharpened. This wasn't just an attack. It was a message. Blake's mouth tightened, and Klein knew it was coming. Tiana's mind sharpened like a blade. She turned toward the door. "We're not done with him yet." Klein's cold smile remained fixed as Tiana strode back into the interrogation room, Blake close behind. Tiana's gaze burned. "What happened at Silverton?" she demanded. Klein's smile widened. "A statement." "From who?" "You already know." Tiana's eyes flashed. "Who supplied the weapons?" Klein's smile didn't waver. "Why don't you ask the people you work for?" Tiana's pulse quickened. "What the hell does that mean?" Blake demanded. Klein's gaze sharpened. "Did you think the corruption stopped with me?" His eyes flicked toward Tiana. "Did you really think you could operate in the shadows without attracting attention?" Tiana's chest tightened. "You thought I was the top of the ladder?" Klein's voice darkened. "I'm a middleman, Cole. The people behind this, they don't sit behind desks in some precinct. They sit in corporate boardrooms, in government offices, and some of them wear stars on their uniforms." Tiana's gaze sharpened. "Names?" Klein's smile was cold. "I don't need to give you names. They'll introduce themselves soon enough." Blake's expression darkened. "Why Silverton?" Klein's smile thinned. "Because it was a test, and your response will determine how quickly they escalate." Tiana's gaze sharpened. Klein leaned forward slightly. "How does it feel, Lieutenant, knowing that the people you swore to protect, the system you fought for, is part of the same machine that created me?" Tiana's jaw flexed. "I've seen that machine before, and yet you still serve it." Tiana's eyes darkened. "Not for long." Klein's smile widened. "I hope you're prepared for what comes next." Tiana's gaze sharpened. "So do I." Tiana stood at the edge of the airstrip, the hum of the jet engines vibrating through her chest. The moonlight glinted off the sleek black frame of the government jet parked on the tarmac. Blake stood beside her, his arms crossed. "This is bigger than we thought," Blake said quietly. Tiana's gaze was cold. "It always is." Blake's mouth tightened. Klein's just the tip of the iceberg. If he's right, this operation extends to military supply chains, intelligence, federal oversight. Tiana's gaze sharpened toward the horizon. "It's not an operation anymore." Blake's eyes narrowed. "Then what is it?" "A war." Tiana turned toward the jet. "I need to find out who's running it." Blake's gaze darkened. "That's dangerous." Tiana's smile was cold. "Then they'll never see it coming." Blake's mouth twitched toward a smile. "Where are you starting?" Tiana's eyes flashed. "Klein said they'd introduce themselves," she replied. "I'm going to give them a chance." Blake's expression tightened. "You don't have to do this alone." "I'm not alone," Tiana said quietly. Blake's brow furrowed. "Back up." Tiana's smile sharpened. "Not exactly." She climbed the jet's narrow steps, disappearing into the dim glow of the interior. Blake's gaze followed her as the jet engines roared to life. Tiana's eyes narrowed toward the dark horizon. "Let them come." The private jet sliced through the darkened sky, its engines humming with a steady, mechanical rhythm. The cabin was dimly lit, the soft glow from the overhead lights casting long shadows across the plush leather seats. Tiana sat alone, her gaze fixed on the tablet resting on the table in front of her. The screen glowed with the classified files Blake had provided, intel pulled from deep within government servers. Names, numbers, supply chains. Everything pointed to a single, dangerous conclusion. Klein was right. This wasn't just corruption. This was an operation, vast, interconnected, and deeply embedded within the highest levels of government and military infrastructure. Someone had built a network designed to funnel military resources, weapons, technology, personnel, through back channels, supplying them to private contractors and criminal enterprises. And it was sanctioned. That was the part that gnawed at her the most. This wasn't just some rogue faction or off-the-books operation. This was organized, protected. Tiana's jaw tightened. She swiped through the files, landing on the name that kept surfacing over and over again. August Mercer, CEO of a global security firm, Titan Holdings. Former Navy. Retired early after receiving multiple commendations for classified operations. His company had deep ties to military supply chains and defense contracts. More than that, Mercer had direct ties to Klein. Financial records showed that Mercer's company had paid millions in consulting fees to Kingsley Logistics, Klein's shell company. Those payments started 7 years ago, right when the spike in military-grade weapons on the black market began. And Mercer wasn't hiding. He was hosting a charity event the next night, a high-profile fundraiser at his private estate. Politicians, military officials, and corporate executives would be there. The perfect place for someone to flex their influence. Tiana's lips thinned. She tapped the screen and pulled up a photo of Mercer. Tall, blonde, handsome, cold blue eyes. A smile that looked calculated rather than genuine. A predator in a tailored suit. Her eyes sharpened. Her phone buzzed. Blake's name flashed across the screen. She answered. Go ahead. Just got off the line with DOJ, Blake said. His voice was low and tense. Mercer's been under quiet investigation for 2 years. Arms trafficking, money laundering, political interference. And they haven't been able to touch him, Blake replied. He's insulated. The charges won't stick unless we get direct evidence. Something that ties him to the attacks. Tiana's gaze sharpened. We have Klein. Not enough, Blake said. Klein's testimony would get buried under legal loopholes and red tape. We need to catch Mercer in the act. Tiana's lips curled faintly. Then I guess it's time to meet him face to face. You know he'll see you coming, Blake warned. Of course, Tiana replied. That's the point. Blake sighed. You're not going to let this go, are you? No, Tiana said simply. Blake hesitated. All right, I'll get you an invitation. I already have one, Tiana replied. Blake's tone sharpened. Ow! Tiana smiled faintly. Mercer's company is looking for new private security consultants. I submitted a resume. Blake's voice turned dark. You're walking into a snake pit. Good, Tiana replied. That's where I'm most comfortable. Tiana adjusted the hem of her dress as she stepped from the sleek black car. The deep crimson silk flowed over her body like water, the high slit on the side giving just enough freedom for movement, or combat, if necessary. Her dark hair was swept back into a low, elegant bun, and a pair of diamond earrings gleamed beneath the glow of the estate's chandeliers. The Mercer estate was vast, a sprawling mansion nestled against the cliffs overlooking the city. The soft crash of the waves against the rocks mixed with the sounds of classical music drifting from the grand ballroom. Guards lined the driveway, dressed in dark suits, their earpieces barely visible beneath the collars of their shirts. Tactical professionals, not standard security. Mercer had spared no expense. Tiana's heels clicked softly against the marble steps as she crossed the threshold into the ballroom. The interior was a masterwork of wealth and influence. Towering ceilings, gilded columns, walls lined with Renaissance art. Servers drifted between guests with glasses of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The crowd was a curated mix of political figures, corporate leaders, and military brass. Tiana's gaze swept the room. And then she saw him. August Mercer stood near the fireplace, a glass of scotch in hand. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his blonde hair combed back with surgical precision. His dark blue suit was tailored to perfection, and his expression was one of relaxed control. A woman in a silver gown leaned into him, laughing at something he said. Mercer's smile was sharp and precise. Tiana's gaze narrowed. She moved toward him with slow, measured grace, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble. Mercer's gaze lifted as she approached. "Miss Cole," he said smoothly, "I'm flattered you accepted my invitation." Tiana smiled faintly. It was too tempting to pass up. Mercer's gaze darkened with quiet amusement. "I'm surprised you made it out of Brinkhaven intact." Tiana's smile didn't falter. "Some of us are harder to kill than others." Mercer chuckled. "Touché." Tiana stepped closer. "Why don't we stop pretending?" Mercer's smile sharpened. "Pretending? You've been following my work," Tiana said. "You knew I was looking to decline. You let me get close." Mercer's eyes gleamed. "You give yourself too much credit." "Do I?" Mercer's smile widened. "I wanted to see how good you were," Mercer said. "I have to admit, you exceeded my expectations." "You've made a lot of enemies," Tiana said. Mercer's smile didn't waver. "That's what happens when you win." Tiana's eyes narrowed. "I'm not here to win. I'm here to end you." Mercer's gaze darkened. "You think you have the power to stop this?" "I don't need power," Tiana replied. "I have truth." Mercer's expression turned cold. "Truth is irrelevant when the system is built to survive it." Tiana's gaze sharpened. "Then I guess we'll have to burn down the system." Mercer's smile widened. "Good luck with that." Mercer leaned toward her. His hand grazed her wrist. "Careful, Lieutenant," Mercer whispered. "You might not like what you find." Tiana's grip tightened. "Neither will you." Mercer's gaze sharpened. "Let the games begin." Suddenly, a sharp voice crackled through Mercer's earpiece. "Sir, we have a situation." Mercer's expression hardened. He pulled back from Tiana, his gaze burning. "What kind of situation?" Mercer demanded. "FBI tactical units just breached the perimeter." Tiana's smile widened. "Oops." Mercer's jaw tightened. "You set me up," he hissed. "You invited me," Tiana replied smoothly. Mercer's gaze darkened. "You have no idea what you've done." "I'm pretty sure I do." Tiana stepped back as the sound of breaking glass filled the air. FBI agents flooded into the ballroom. "August Mercer." Blake's voice echoed across the room. "Put your hands where I can see them." Mercer's gaze sharpened. His smile returned. "I guess this is where the fun starts." Tiana's eyes gleamed. "I'm counting on it." August Mercer's eyes gleamed beneath the low light of the grand ballroom as chaos erupted around them. FBI agents swarmed through the gilded doors, weapons drawn, barking orders as terrified guests scattered. Champagne glasses shattered against the marble floor, and the delicate strains of classical music were replaced by the thudding of boots and the sharp crackle of radios. Mercer's smile didn't waver. Tiana's eyes locked onto his, her gaze hard and cutting. "Put your hands in the air." Blake's voice boomed from across the room. Mercer's gaze didn't leave Tiana's face. His smile widened. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands. "I hope you know what you're doing, Lieutenant," Mercer said smoothly. "I'm exactly where I need to be," Tiana replied coldly. Blake and a team of agents closed in, their rifles trained on Mercer's chest. "August Mercer, you're under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, arms trafficking, and obstruction of justice," Blake announced. "You have the right to remain silent." Mercer's smile sharpened. "Spare me the speech, Agent Blake." Blake's eyes narrowed. "Turn around." Mercer chuckled as Blake's men seized his arms and pulled them behind his back. "You're making a mistake," Mercer said as the zip ties cinched tight around his wrists. "You think this ends with me?" Tiana stepped toward him. "No," she said. "It ends tonight." Mercer's eyes glittered with malice. "You have no idea how deep this goes." "You've been saying that a lot," Tiana replied. "And yet, here you are in cuffs." Mercer's smile turned cold. "Do you think you caught me?" Tiana's gaze sharpened. Mercer leaned toward her, his lips curling into a razor-sharp smile. "I'll let you catch me." Tiana's eyes narrowed. "What the hell are you talking about?" Mercer's gaze burned with quiet amusement. You think I didn't plan for this? Mercer's voice dropped to a low, lethal whisper. You think I didn't know exactly how this would play out? Tiana's pulse quickened. What did you do? Mercer smiled wider. Check your phone. Tiana's gaze flicked toward Blake. Blake's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. His face paled. Blake! Tiana's tone sharpened. Blake's jaw tightened. Shit. He turned the phone toward her. A live news alert scrolled across the screen. Breaking news. Multiple explosions at U.S. military supply bases overseas. Casualties reported. Tiana's breath tightened. Targets include high-level military installations in Europe and the Middle East, Blake said grimly. Simultaneous strikes. Coordinated. Tiana's gaze snapped toward Mercer. You're behind this. Mercer's smile widened. Not directly, but let's just say I created the opportunity. Tiana's breath sharpened. You gave the order before you walked into this room. No, Mercer replied smoothly. I set in motion months ago. All I needed was a spark. Tiana's chest tightened. Mercer's gaze gleamed with cold triumph. And you provided it. Tiana's jaw flexed. What's the target? Mercer's smile turned razor sharp. The system. Tiana's heart hammered. You wanted me to catch you, Tiana realized. Mercer's smile was cold. Because while you were chasing me, the real operation moved forward. Tiana's gaze darkened. Who's behind it? Mercer chuckled. You already know. Tiana's gaze sharpened. The contractors, she said. The defense firms. The politicians. Mercer's smile widened. And you think arresting me is going to stop them? Mercer said softly. They've already won. Tiana's pulse steadied. You're wrong, she said coldly. Mercer's gaze sharpened. Am I? Tiana stepped closer. You think you've built something untouchable, Tiana said. A perfect machine. But machines have weak points. Mercer's eyes narrowed. And you know what they say about weak points? Tiana's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. They could be exploited. Mercer's smile flattened. You don't have enough leverage. Tiana's smile sharpened. That's where you're wrong. She turned toward Blake. Do it, she said. Blake's gaze sharpened. He nodded toward one of the agents standing nearby. The agent handed him a tablet. Blake tapped the screen, and the projection flashed against the wall. The image was grainy but clear. Mercer's face appeared on the screen, speaking directly to Klein, talking about shipments, bribery, political buyouts. Tiana's gaze hardened. Turns out, Tiana said, Klein was wearing a wire. Mercer's smile faded. Tiana stepped closer, her gaze burning. You wanted a war? You got one. Mercer's eyes darkened. You think you can control what happens next? Tiana's eyes flashed. I'm not trying to control it. Mercer's smile returned, but this time it was thin and strained. You don't know what you've unleashed, Mercer said softly. Neither do you, Tiana replied. Blake's gaze sharpened. Take him. The agents hauled Mercer to his feet. His smile remained fixed, but his eyes burned with quiet fury. You can't stop them, Mercer said as they pulled him toward the exit. Tiana's smile was cold. Watch me. Tiana stood on the balcony overlooking the city. The skyline stretched beneath the morning light, golden hues glinting off the glass towers. The storm had passed, but the air remained heavy with tension. Blake stepped out onto the balcony, his expression grim. They're calling it the largest coordinated strike on U.S. infrastructure since Pearl Harbor, Blake said. Tiana's gaze darkened. Casualties? 17 dead, Blake replied. Over 50 wounded. Damage to 3 strategic supply bases. Tiana's jaw tightened. Mercer's team? She asked. Blake's expression darkened. Disappeared. Clean extraction. No trace. Tiana's gaze sharpened. It wasn't just Mercer. No, Blake agreed. It was bigger. Tiana's eyes narrowed toward the distant horizon. We need to find the others, she said. Blake's gaze tightened. And when you find them? Tiana's gaze was cold. I finished what I started. Blake studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Mercer's in federal custody, Blake said. They'll try to cut a deal. Tiana's smile didn't reach her eyes. They won't get one. Blake's mouth tightened. And the network? Tiana's gaze sharpened. They built a machine, Tiana said. Now we tear it apart. Blake's brow furrowed. You really think you can stop it? Tiana's smile sharpened. I don't need to stop it, she said. I just need to make it bleed. Blake's expression darkened. Where do we start? Tiana's eyes gleamed. We start with the people who built it. She turned toward the city, her silhouette dark against the morning light. Let them come.